So there were a bunch of these. A lot of people wanted you to clarify your tweet about Kavanaugh.
Yes.
Oh yeah, okay. Well, I'll clarify it in two ways. The first thing is that I promised my son about a month ago that I wouldn't make casual statements on Twitter, that what I would do is write a blog post, and I should have. I mean, Eric Weinstein had posted a Twitter saying, well, we don't know what to do because we're kind of screwed both ways at the moment. You know, if Kavanaugh is taken out, you know, this was obviously before it looked like he was going to win the nomination or be approved. That only became clear in about the last 3 days. And so I was trying to put myself in Kavanaugh's position, thinking, okay, well, if he was a client of mine, what would I recommend? And I thought, well, it's very tricky. It's very difficult to put myself in someone's position like that. But I thought, well, the problem is he can't just withdraw because his life is over if he withdraws. Okay, and then if he gets the nomination, well, then what? Well, then he's cleared at least, as cleared as he's ever going to get, which is not entirely cleared, which is unfortunate because the possibility that he can be entirely cleared is off the table. That's not going to happen. So he's in a position where he's being compromised. That's it. His reputation has been compromised. And this is completely independent of what he's done. I have no idea what he's done. Who the hell knows what happened 35 years ago? I've worked on court cases where people made accusations 40 years in the past. Man, and you think today is murky, you should try looking 40 years ago and see how murky that is. It's really... So then I thought, well, let's say he gets approved. But then what? You know, like I read today, for example, NBC News, this was their coverage. There's already 153,000 signatures on in a petition that's hypothetically sponsored by the Democrats, if I remember correctly. They're a fragmented group, so God only knows what that means. Well, so are the Republicans. It's not like it's a homogenous group. It's like, you know, there's crazy Republicans and there's crazy Democrats, and so it's hard to tell what that means, but there's already 153,000 signatures calling for his impeachment. You know, and I was thinking, well, if I put myself in Kavanaugh's position, which I can do to some degree, because people have gone after my reputation in every bloody way, almost every way you can think of. Not every way. There's still ways they haven't. But lots of ways. And I thought, well, if the goal is peace, let's say, maybe the best possible outcome would be for Kavanaugh to get confirmed and then to withdraw on the hope that they could put another candidate in place who's as conservative, so there'd be no loss on the political front, but so that maybe the next nomination process wouldn't be of a sort that leaves the whole structure of the judiciary subject to permanent partisan dispute. Now, so I thought, well, maybe we could have our cake and eat it too. He could be cleared because there's insufficient evidence to pursue him. He could still have his life. We could bring another conservative candidate on board. We, you know, I mean everyone. We could bring another conservative candidate on board. The Supreme Court could be filled, and some of the tension with regards to the polarized political system could be rectified. So that was my thinking, and like. I couldn't explain. I said a sentence that was stupid because I kind of thought that some of that would be self-evident, but of course it wasn't. And it was just foolishness, you know, on my part. I should have known that wouldn't be self-evident. So I explained it some more today in a sequence of tweets, but that was the idea. And, you know, people said, no, that's wrong because if you let the accusers knock you out of the race, then they win, and all that does is embolden them, and you should know better than that because you have told people not to withdraw, and, you know, and look, fair enough, man. I mean, I don't know what the hell is the right way out of this mess. I mean, I don't see a clear path forward out of this. You know, what I see now is that, I mean, I don't like the believe the accuser philosophy. I think that's an appalling philosophy. You have to be naive beyond comprehension to think that that's a good idea, to think that people wouldn't misuse. If that was the rule, every accuser is right. Oh, that's a great rule. That is. You know, I'm not willing to give up the presumption of innocence or the idea that it's better to let, 10 guilty people walk free than to convict one innocent person. That's a good bloody rule. That's a good rule. And we don't just give that rule up because we're feeling all empathic and morally superior about it. So, but we've got a problem, and the problem is that I don't see any way of moving this forward without exacerbating the polarized tension. Now, some of the people who objected to what I said, well, bring on the tension. Maybe we need to play this out thoroughly, rather than making premature peace. It's like, look, could be. I mean, I can't tell. It was just, I was trying to think of some way that might work out in the relatively short term for everyone concerned. And it seemed to me that it would be something for Kavanaugh to consider, because he would have got the nomination. So at this stage, that's a feather in his hat. I mean, it's a crumpled feather and it's a dirty hat because it's been such a bloody mess, but it's not nothing. It means he could walk away without being killed by this. That would be something. And maybe you could make a case that if he was acting, you could make a case that one way of acting in a patriotic manner, although not necessarily the only way, would be to sacrifice his personal ambition and allow another candidate to step in his place. And I'm not saying that's right. I'm just saying that was, Jesus, just because you think something doesn't mean it's right. I was trying to puzzle this through, and that's another possible pathway.
I think the short answer is Twitter sucks.
Well, 12 Rules for Life, which is the nominal title for this talk, is a reasonably accessible book. It's taken me about 30 years to distill what I've been thinking about to something that's more easily communicable. I don't know how easily communicable it is yet, but it's getting there. I thought I'd tell you a little bit about how it all came about. I was thinking about this line today. I think I was thinking about it because of the Kavanaugh hearings and because of everything that's been going on, all the destabilization that seems to be characteristic of the political dialogue right now. And, when times are unstable, then you look for bedrock, and maybe you wonder, you look for bedrock, but you're not necessarily convinced that bedrock exists. And I guess that's really what I've been curious about my whole life, is whether or not bedrock exists. I looked up the Declaration of Independence tonight, just the first couple of lines. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That's an interesting line. One of the things that my book is being criticized for is its self-evidence. There's all these rules, and people who have been not very happy with me have referred to them as rather banal. It's not like I didn't know that when I wrote them. I knew that they were ideas that everybody already had. They were self-evident. But sometimes you forget what's self-evident, and you start to question it. Then you have to figure out why it's self-evident again. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what does it even mean for something to be self-evident? Because it's not obvious, right? You could put any set of propositions forth as self-evident, hypothetically, but there are a set of propositions that everyone shared enough so that you could found your country on them. And they weren't originated in the United States. They were the consequence of much work that had been done before in places like Britain, and then much work that had been done before that across the West, and then much work that had been done before that, reaching back into dim prehistory, trying to sort out what might constitute fundamental truth. They're deep. That's why they're self-evident. All men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Well, those aren't those might be self-evident propositions, but they're by no means bloody obvious, that's for sure. Because it isn't obvious at all what you mean when you say all men are created equal. Because wherever you look, what you see is vast variety in the nature of human beings. Not only in what they're capable of, what they're endowed with, let's say, what they accomplish, but also what they glean or gather as a consequence of their labors. Inequality seems to be the rule. And it certainly was the rule in societies. It was the rule, and I would say, celebrated rule. The rule of inequality was celebrated prior to the emergence of this set of ideas that's laid out in such an articulate manner in the Declaration of Independence. It wasn't like aristocrats back in aristocratic society were upset about the fact that they were aristocrats. They felt that that was a perfectly reasonable reflection of the natural order. So it's not obvious at all what it means that all men are created equal. And it's certainly not obvious what it means that we're all endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, unalienable rights. And so hold that in mind for a moment. I was curious about what was happening in the Cold War, because it seemed to me to be the height of insanity that people would pit, human beings would pit two competing belief systems against one another, because of course that's what was happening, and then put everything on the line for it, right? Not just the present, let's say, but in the case of total thermonuclear disaster, the past and the future as well, to stake everything on this ideological conflict. I thought, well, what in the world is driving that? Why is it that people are so tied to their beliefs? And what is a belief anyways? What is a belief system? Why do people care about it? And why do we group together to protect it? Why would we fight a war to put our perspective forward, and more mysteriously, why would we risk everything to protect it? And so that was the question that I was attempting to address, have been attempting to address. And there was more to it than that, not so much a consequence of studying what happened between the Americans, say, and the Soviet Union. I mean, the West and the Soviet Union, a more accurate way of putting it. But I was also reading a lot about Nazi Germany and what happened there. It struck me at a more personal level somehow that the conflict between the communist bloc and the West seemed sociological and political and economic and also psychological. But much of what I read about Nazi Germany really seemed psychological. And I was really, really interested in how people could have conducted themselves the way that the camp guards in the concentration camps conducted themselves, because by the time I was doing this reading, I was no longer naive enough to assume that those people who were the guards were somehow qualitatively different creatures than myself. I mean, that's a very horrifying realization. It's something I've been trying to teach my students for 40 years, that if you were in Nazi Germany, the probability that you would have been one of the bad guys rather than one of the good guys is statistically overwhelming, and that's a real, because one of the ideas that I kept encountering, especially with regards to what happened in Nazi Germany, was, well, we have to remember what happened so we don't repeat it. And I thought, by then I also knew something about memory, and I thought, well, you can't remember something you don't understand. If you don't know the moral of the story, you can't remember. What are you supposed to remember? Don't do it. Well, don't do what? Exactly. Because if you can't figure out, this is a real clinical truism. If you get involved in something bad and you don't know how you got involved, then you haven't processed the event. You haven't extracted out the wisdom from the event. You don't know how to avoid it in the future. I didn't see any evidence whatsoever that we'd figured out what had happened in Nazi Germany. Crimes of obedience, everyone followed the leader. It's like, no, I don't buy it. Well, why would everyone follow the leader? That's the first question, so it's not much of an explanation anyways. I actually don't think that's what the data suggest. I think when you look at a system like Nazi Germany or the Soviets, the Stalinist Soviet Union, the Soviet Union period for that matter, it's not corruption at the top and innocent people all the way down to the bottom. It's no bloody way, man. The corruption is at every single level of the hierarchy of society, right down to the bottom. And it's there equally across the entire structure. In Eastern Germany, 1/3 of people were government informers. So if you have a family of 6 people, then 2 of them were government informers. I mean, you don't get to there by obeying the leaders, even though I know that once these totalitarian systems start, the pressure to obey the leaders becomes increasingly overwhelming, and you can get tangled up in that and not be able to escape, maybe even regardless of your own personal ethic. That's a complicated question, but, you know, that's widespread corruption when 1 out of 3 people is a government informer. I mean, that's not top-down, that's not the top-down mediated obedience of millions of innocent people. That's collaboration on the part of everyone. So, and everyone means you. And so when I read about what happened in Nazi Germany and what happened in the Soviet Union, I thought, that's me. That's the thing about history. It's something I try to tell my students. Why should you learn history? Well, because you're a historical creature. History is about you. And you look in the past and you see all the things that people have done. You think, well, I'm a person. I've done that. I mean, I know that you have to separate yourself out as an individual in some sense from the great crimes of the past. I'm not a fan of identity politics, you know. I don't mean you bear the kind of personal responsibility for the horrors of the past that would enable someone to hold you hold you responsible in a legal sense as if you committed the crime yourself. I think that's an absolutely pathological viewpoint. But the point is that it has something to do with capability. It's capability or temptation, something like that. When that's happened to so many millions of people, that kind of corruption, then there's a good possibility that you could fall prey to exactly the same thing if the circumstances laid it out that way. And so that was very frightening to me. And you know, and it was more frightening too, because one of the things I also came to understand is that it isn't obvious that the people who did the terrible things that occurred in Nazi Germany, let's say, didn't do it with some substantial amount of satisfaction. So not only can you do those things, but A, you can convince yourself that you're acting morally while you're doing them. So that's a nasty little twist right there. And you can also enjoy it. So that's dark. That's very dark, and it is dark. This sort of thing. It really is. You know, the snake is a kind of predator, and one of the things that the entire here's why I'm telling you all this, at least in part. I told you I wanted to talk to you about the structure of belief systems, and I wanted to talk to you about what self-evidence meant, and one of the propositions that I've been working on for a very long time, it's partly nested in the psychoanalytic ideas, is that the way we look at the world is nested inside something that's like a dream or a story. And the reason that we can say some things are self-evident in that articulated manner is because we take the platform, this would be the Constitution in this case, it would literally be that. Say, well, here's the Constitution, and it depends on certain axiomatic statements, that's what's self-evident. But the self-evidence is predicated on something else. It's nested in something, and what the self-evidence is nested in is something like a dream or a story. And the self-evidence that underlies our culture is nested in this underlying dream or story that takes a religious form. And that's articulated to the degree that we've been able to articulate it in the stories, for example, that are part of the biblical corpus. So it's like the dream that sits underneath our culture. Now you might think, well, we don't need a dream to sit under our culture, but it doesn't look like that's how the world works, because you need to have a dream that sits under you. Because if you're deprived of dreams for 2 weeks, you'll lose your mind. You can't tolerate that. Your articulated self has to immerse itself in the world of dreams every night, or you'll lose your mind. Now, we don't know why that is exactly, but we know that it is. And so we do know that your consciousness, as it's articulated, has to be nested in this unarticulated, dreamlike surround in order for it to be able to maintain its integrity. And the psychoanalysts, Freud and Jung as well, believed that the same relationship between waking consciousness and the relationship between waking consciousness and the dream was the same as the relationship between articulated cultural knowledge and the religious substructure. Now, Jung took that farther than Freud. Freud touched on it with his Oedipal complex, which is a mythological idea, but Jung took that much further. And I think that that's true. I think what he said was true. And okay, so I'm trying to take apart what it is that makes us think that self-evident things are self-evident so that we can know that now. and understand it instead of letting it merely remain self-evident. The reason I was trying to do that was when I was working on this problem of the Cold War, I thought, well, okay, look, we've got this one system over here on the left, the communist system, and we've got this other system over here on the right, so to speak, and one is a free market, individual sovereign, democratic system that emerged out of the Judeo-Christian ethic and was transformed to some degree by the Enlightenment. That's one system. And then the other system is whatever it was that the communists erected their system on. And that was like a rationalist philosophy that was constructed in large part in the late 1800s. Said, well, what was this war about? Was it just a war between two arbitrary games? Equally arbitrary, right? It was game A or game B. And game A could have been right, and game B could have been right. And who the hell's to say? And maybe there's 3 other games that we could have been playing instead, and they could have all gone to war too. And in a morally relativistic universe, there's no distinguishing one of the games from the other. That's possible. Well, that's what I was curious about. It's like, what was this? Just a matter of opinion? This war? Or was there something deeper at stake? Like, were the presuppositions that the Marxists brought to bear to transform the world that were put into practice in the Soviet Union, Mao's China, another perfectly reasonable set of propositions? They sounded good, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Jesus, it sounds good, you know? So what happens if you put it into practice? Well, maybe you should. Maybe it's preferable to we hold these truths to be self-evident. Who knows? No one, obviously, because that's why we had to have a whole war about it and put the whole planet at risk. It's like, so I was interested in analyzing that. It's like, okay, was this just arbitrary opinion, or was there, I didn't believe it really, but I didn't know, or was there something going on in the West, or perhaps in the Soviet Union, that was deeper than mere opinion? And so that was part of the investigation into what constituted self-evidence. And that's what took me into the rabbit hole underneath, the rabbit hole of structures that are underneath normal consciousness, let's say, and down into the realm of whatever it is that we ground what we hold self-evident to be. We live in these little conceptual worlds. They're like walled gardens. They're partly a creation of nature and partly a creation of culture, so walled garden is a good metaphor, and that's what paradise means. Paradise means walled garden. And so we do live in walled gardens. That's a good way of thinking about it conceptually. And something can pop up inside the walled garden that's disruptive. And it does always, because you bound a space, you know, and you try to keep what you don't want in that space out, but it's really hard to keep it out. It comes in, and it's because it's very hard to separate something from everything else. You know, like, here's an example. Maybe you have some kids, and you want to protect them from the internet. And you know, you can understand why you might want to do that. And so you try to protect them from the internet, but you find that because the culture has made the internet so pervasive that in order to protect it from them, you're trying to protect them from danger, right? You have to ramp up your surveillance of them to an incredible degree. And then as you try more and more to protect them from the internet, and you become that protective force, but you drive yourself to be more and more aware of absolutely everything they do and keep them under surveillance all the time to protect them, then you become exactly the thing that you're trying to protect them against. Right. So you see what I mean, is that it's not easy to keep that sort of danger away. You know, and something that wants to protect you too much can become your worst enemy. And so that's a good example of how difficult it is to parcel off a bounded space without letting something that isn't supposed to be in there come in. And I think that's why in the story of Adam and Eve, one of the things you ask yourself is, well, what the hell's up with God and the snake? It's like, he's God after all. He made paradise. Why do you have to put a snake in there? And the answer might be, you can't make a walled garden without having a snake in it. It's just not possible. Like, there can't be everything, and then a little piece of everything that's completely walled off from the rest of the everything. That doesn't work. It comes in, inevitably. And, well, that's why you can't overprotect your children, as far as I'm concerned. You can't make a safe space for your children, because they're in the world. Even if they're in your house, it's still the world. And no matter what you do, it's still the world. You're not going to get rid of the things that come in. You're not going to get rid of the things under their bed, or in the closet, or lurking in the playground, or lurking in you. And that's the relationship between the snake and Satan himself. That's the relationship, is that there's a thing that lurks and comes in. You say, well, then you might ask yourself, what's the ultimate thing that lurks and comes in? So what's the ultimate disruptor? That's another way of thinking about it. And one way of thinking about it is that it's something as mundane as something we're afraid of physically. We're afraid of snakes, for example. It's something that mundane. You think, well, that's the source of disruption. That's the source of evil. It's like, well, wait a second. Wait a second. It's not a sophisticated enough way of looking at it. You might think, it's not the snake, it's the place that snakes come from. And you get rid of the snake and you get rid of the place that snakes come from. But then you're still stuck with other people, let's say. And they have their own problems and troubles and their own potential for malevolence. So there's snakes that inhabit them, let's say, from a psychological perspective. And so then you protect yourself from all other people. And you wall yourself off and you try to make a space where none of that can come to get you. And then you find out that you have exactly the same problem inside you. And so that's why that idea emerged. It was a psychologization of the idea of the intrinsic threat that lurks in bounded spaces. It's like, what's the threat? Well, maybe it's a predator. It's like, well, that's not good enough. Maybe it's other people, because they can be terrible predators, worse than any other sort of predator. Yeah, fair enough. So you protect yourself from other people. Not good enough. Not good enough. There's still a predator in your own heart. And it's really there. And so, well, how do you know it's really there? Because if you encounter it, it can damage you. It will damage you. That's how you know it's there. Well, and that's what I was trying to figure out when I was reading about the camp guard, say, in Auschwitz. It's like, okay, well, there's the Auschwitz guard, and isn't he terrible? It's like, yeah, for sure. And didn't he come from a terrible culture? It's like, absolutely. And aren't I a lot like him? Absolutely. And so that makes the threat, that makes the threat worse, because it's no longer outside. It's no longer something you can point at and dismiss. You have to say, no, I'm carrying that around with me. And so then I thought, well, well, then how do you constrain that? That's the next question. What do you do about that? What do you do about that? That's when I realized, I think, or I realized, at least for me, that the problem of Auschwitz and the problem of the gulags in the Soviet Union wasn't political or economic or sociological. It was psychological. And it was part, in this perverse way, in some sense, it was part of the battle that Solzhenitsyn described. He said, the line between good and evil doesn't run between political parties, say, or between tribes of people. It runs down everyone's heart. And I think that that's also the theme of great literature, because when you read a great literary work, what you see is conflict within characters, not between them. You see it between them as well, but it's got to be within them, or it's not realistic. It's like, well, all those people are the bad people, and all these people are the good people. It's like, sorry, it doesn't work that way. Then even if you do get rid of all the bad people, which you can't, by getting rid of them, you're no longer one of the good people, generally speaking. And then you're also stuck with the probability that you haven't dealt with the problem. You're stuck with the problem that you haven't dealt with the problem. It doesn't work that way. And so there's this ancient idea that's part of this understructure that we regard as self-evident, that we each have a moral duty to constrain the malevolence that exists within ourselves. And I think that that's a fundamental truth. I really believe that that's a fundamental truth. You have to take the problem of malevolence seriously, and the way to take it seriously is to confront it within yourself. It's not the only way to take it seriously, but all of the other ways that you would take it seriously in the absence of also doing that are not going to work. So it's part of being in this self-conscious story. That the fundamental story is something like the battle of good and evil. And it's part of being involved in that, and that is what you're involved in. That's part of what's self-evident, what we come to believe is self-evident. So that's why I've been going around talking to people about responsibility. Is that it's important to take on the responsibility for your life, because that's part of the way that you constrain the malevolence that's part and parcel of your fundamental nature. And there isn't anything that you can do that's more important than that. And I think that it's interesting, because it's a religious call to action in some sense, because it's an invitation to join in the eternal battle against evil. Let's look at it that way. It's also a more believable clarion call, I think, because sometimes you're enticed into believing that you could be part of the force of good, let's say. And it's like, well, the problem with that is that kind of self-serving. You know, it's easy to get tangled up in that. I think it's a lot more reliable and a lot more honest to think, no, you'd be doing pretty good if you just kept an eye on the part of yourself that was directing itself towards something approximating hell. And that would be good, and if you could manage that, well, more power to you. And you're not going to get all egotistical about that, right? You'll stay reasonably humble if that's your goal. And that's a good thing, because that's the problem with getting inflated. You think, well, I'm on the side of the good. It's like, yeah, maybe. Sometimes, if the cost isn't too high, and if enough people are watching. It's the other times that we're concerned about. You know, and I think a lot of what's driving the polarization that's part and parcel of our dialogue right now is that kind of moral posturing on both sides. You know, and it's one side looks at the other, and each side can point to something to blame, and often with justification. But I think as long as it's the other side, it's so tricky because it's not like we don't act politically. But I think as long as your fundamental focus is on those other people who aren't doing things right, then you're part of the problem and not part of the solution. That's how it looks to me. Rule 6, for example. Rule 6 is a very dark rule. It's called put your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. And you know, I spend a lot of time. I don't know why I was so attracted to dark things, but I certainly was. Well, God only knows why. You know, you don't know what drives you. Maybe it's my depressive bent. Who knows? But I read a lot about totalitarian states, and I read a lot about terrible people too. I mean, it's partly part of my training, right? Because I'm a clinical psychologist, and I did a lot of work on aggression. I studied aggression, antisocial behavior, criminality, alcoholism, a lot when I was in graduate school and for some time afterwards. And so I was really interested in criminal behavior and the motivations for especially psychopathic criminal acts, cruel criminal acts, school shootings and that sort of thing, serial killing, that part of the criminal spectrum that seems to, it's, you know, look, if someone steals your car, it's like he's actually your friend, you know, because he thinks you have a nice car, and so do you, and he thinks a car is a good thing, and so do you, and he thinks someone should own it, and so do you, but he thinks he should own it instead of you, and it's like, that's a trivial difference of opinion, man. The guy's on your side. But when someone shoots up an elementary school, that's a whole different kettle of fish. And so those were the people that I was interested in, you know. And so I was interested in knowing, and you know, one of the things that I came to understand is that people see this is tangled up with the other ideas that I've been talking to you about, but it's hard to make the connection. See, a lot of these connections we make with stories, and the connections are there, but we don't understand them, and the reason we don't understand them is they're too damn complicated. That's why we still have them in stories. They're so complicated, the only way we can understand them is stories. We're not smart enough to get them to be fully articulated. You know, you can find most of Freud in Shakespeare, but it's not explicit. It's still people acting it out. It's not someone saying, well, here are the rules. This is why King Lear acts the way he does. He just acts, and it makes sense in a narrative sense, and you can grasp it, but you can't consciously articulate the relationships. And the thing about these profound stories that our culture's nested in, these ancient religious stories, is that they contain truths that are unutterably profound. But that's the problem. They're actually unutterably profound. So back to the these relationships are drawn, but it isn't necessarily the case that we can understand them. Oh no, I just lost my train of thought for a second here. I've been running lots of trains simultaneously. Some of them have gone astray. So, I say now I'm becoming self-conscious, which is a terrible thing to have happen. So I was talking about responsibility and self-evidence. Yes, that's exactly it, and about the necessity for us to start to awaken to these sorts of things. So back to the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. So one of the propositions that I was laying out before you was a bit of an explanation of what constitutes self-evidence. Self-evidence occurs when your articulated representation makes reference to shared stories. And so it's self-evident because the story is shared, and so everyone knows the story, and if you make reference to the story, then people understand it. And so you've got the grounds for self-evidence. And one of the points I was trying to make tonight is that part of what's self-evident is everyone's capacity for malevolence, and that capacity is very, very deep. So that's, and you know this, you kind of know this already. I can tell you how you know. I mean, you hold each other culpable for your actions and inactions, that's partly it. You hold yourself culpable for that, even if you don't want to, and even if you defend yourself with all sorts of rationalizations, it tends not to work very well. So you know when you've wandered off the path, and you're likely to flagellate yourself even more intently than is absolutely necessary, even though you might not want to. You know, you wake up at 3 in the morning and sweat away because of something that's happened, and you feel terrible about it because, well, you've wandered off the path and you know it perfectly well. So we all know these sorts of things. That's part of what makes us equal, right? Because that's the part of the self-evidence. It's like, well, what's this equality? Well, it's some nature that we share. And that proclivity towards malevolence is part of that nature. That's, you know, one of the ideas that's really taken a tremendous amount of criticism in recent years is the idea of original sin. And it's not surprising that that idea has been criticized, because it's not a very pleasant idea, right? That we each inherit some flaw, you know, that's traced back to Adam. That's the narrative representation of that idea. But well, people act that way. I mean, the environmentalists, speaking broadly, who aren't generally, they're not in the same conceptual universe, say, as the fundamentalists. They're not into the whole original sin thing, generally speaking. But they certainly believe that there's something about people that is polluting the planet. And all I see in that is a re-representation of the idea of original sin. There's something intrinsically wrong with us, you know, and the way we're manifesting that is by ruining the planet. It's the same idea. I don't think you can get away from the idea. I think that no matter which way you turn politically or conceptually, you carry along the shadow of the idea of original sin, because you know, because you're stuck with exactly what the story of Adam and Eve tells you that you're stuck with, which is an inalienable sense of your own vulnerability, knowledge of your own fragility and subjection to anxiety and pain, and the ability to produce that in others, which is equivalent to moral knowledge. And as soon as you have that, well then you're in the realm of, for lack of a better word, and there isn't a better word, you're in the realm of sin instantly. And there's no way around that. Like, you're there, and that's that, and it's permanent. And that's part of what makes us equal. And so that's a very dark thing, that, but it's a very interesting thing. But it's a strange thing, because obviously in that initial opening statement, the idea of being equal is also something very positive, because it's partly associated with the idea of unalienable rights, and then that gives rise to the whole constitutional framework, and then this domain of freedom that all of you people, and me as well, being Canadian in part, roughly speaking, of the same system, we all cherish to a greater or lesser degree and appreciate. So the idea of equality can't only be something as negative as I've laid out. When something emerges that sets you back on your heels, you put yourself together and you advance courageously. And it doesn't mean that you don't think there's danger. That just makes you stupid or naive. That's not helpful. You advance despite the fact that there's danger. So one of the things that I've done with my clinical clients quite frequently, you know, they went through this transformation process. First they were naive, and so they thought everyone was good, including them. That's not helpful, because people are good, but they're also not good at all. And so that's half the story. You don't want to know half the story, you want to know the whole story. And so people have a marked proclivity towards good and a marked proclivity towards evil, and you need to know both of those things. And so naive people think that people are good, and that makes them open and trusting, but it doesn't make them moral and courageous, because if you're naive, if you're open and trusting because you don't know you can get hurt, that's not a moral virtue, that just means you're naive. And so what happens if you're naive is that someone will betray you, that's for sure, and if it isn't someone that you need, it's yourself, And it doesn't matter, because then your naivety will come tumbling down, and you'll feel betrayed, and then you won't be able to trust people. And so what's strange about that, so then you're nihilistic and cynical, and maybe you're depressed and anxious as well. And that's actually better than being naive, even though it's a lot more unpleasant. But even though it's better, and you might feel morally superior to the naive people. It's like, look at you think butter wouldn't melt in your mouth. You think people are good. I know better. I've had contact with the world. Terrible things have happened to me. And now I know. It's like, yeah, but you're halfway there at that point. Like, you've gone down, but you haven't come back up. Because the next thing is, so, you know, my clients would tell me, say, well, I've been terribly betrayed in my love life. Why should I ever find anyone to trust? How am I ever going to trust anyone again? Well, that's a great question. It's like, well, you might be betrayed, so how can I tell you to trust someone? Well, I can't trust people because they're not trustworthy. It's like, yeah, true. So maybe there's another reason to trust people. You trust people because you're courageous, not because they're trustworthy. And what's so interesting about that is that that's past naivety and past nihilism. It's back up to something else. It's like, I know perfectly well that you're just as full of snakes as me. Nonetheless, I'm going to hold up my hand and say, well, let's move forward together. And if I'm able to do that with a certain amount of faith and courage, then the probability that will work is instantly magnified, right? Because if you do, for most people, despite their tenuous positioning on the continuum between good and evil, if you hold out a hand to them and meet them in the best of all possible places, then you increase the probability that they will respond in kind. And that definitely works. And so you overcome the probability of betrayal with courage, not naivety. And that's part of voluntarily facing the world. And it's the same with your fears. There's plenty to be afraid of. There's more to be afraid of even than you think, right? I mean, because life is a fatal game, and you're all in. And so everything there is to be afraid of is there. You might say, well, how can you possibly cope with that? And, you know, the idea would be, well, let's build a wall around things. It's like, well, no, everything comes in under the wall. It's not helpful. And I'm not saying there shouldn't be borders between things. This isn't an argument that's naive. That's not my point. My point is that you overcome fear not with safety, but with courage. And that's rule one, right? To stand up straight with your shoulders back. That's what that whole chapter is about. It's not about developing power so you can take your place in the tyrannical patriarchy. You know, first of all, power isn't the most reliable means to acquiring position in a functional hierarchy. It's competence that's the best practice if you want to acquire position in a hierarchy, unless the hierarchy is corrupt, and our hierarchies aren't that corrupt. They're kind of corrupt, except compared to every other hierarchy everywhere else that's ever been created. So, well, it's an important distinction. One of the things that I find absolutely appalling about the modern universities is their failure to evince any gratitude whatsoever. It's like, well, what we have around us is flawed in an indefinite number of ways, but compared to what exactly? Like, what are you comparing it to? The way things were 50 years ago? It's better. The way things were 120 years ago? It's incomparably better. The way things are in most places in the world? Well, go somewhere else and find out. You know, how many countries in the world are places where people, given their free choice, would move to? Like 30? And there's 200 countries? So, yeah, we've got a corruption problem and we have a patriarchy problem because our structures tend towards tyranny just like every other structure. But, you know, for flawed creatures in a flawed world, we're not doing so bad. And a little gratitude for that wouldn't be such a terrible thing. Back to the equality idea, all created equal. Well, I said that one of the hallmarks of equality is everyone's propensity for malevolence. And I like that argument because it's believable. And so it's good to start with a believable argument. If you want a foundation, because I opened this whole talk saying, well, let's see if we can find a foundation. It's like, we're all capable of evil. Argue yourself out of that. Good luck. And it's deep. And you think, well, Jesus, that's a hell of a negative foundation. What do you do with that? It's like, no, it's not, that's not it exactly. You know, there's another idea, and this goes along with facing what you fear. So you face what you fear and you get stronger. Well, what are you most afraid of, or what's most horrifying? Well, it might be the infinite abyss of malevolence, right? I mean, that's about as bad as it gets. What happens when you face that? Well, that's when you find the other part of the equality argument, the equal, that all men are created equal. It's like, although we have that capacity for malevolence, we have the ability to transcend it. We have the ability to confront it, just like we have the ability to confront our fears. And so what I've become convinced of by studying malevolence for decades, as seriously as I could, is that the capacity for good is more powerful than the capacity for evil. Because if we can confront our fear, and if we can confront our malevolence voluntarily, then we can discover what's in us that allows us to transcend that. And then you think, well, imagine that there's something that's absolutely terrible, a dragon, a fire-breathing dragon. It's the worst thing you can possibly imagine. Well, what's more powerful than that? And that's easy. Whatever can defeat it. And so if the terror and the malevolence are fundamental realities, then anything that can defeat that is a more fundamental reality. And so one of the things I've become convinced of is that with sufficient courage and faith, then we can find within ourselves what's necessary to overcome malevolence, no matter how deeply rooted that malevolence is. There's something in us that can move in the opposite direction and emerge victorious over that. And so it's so perverse, because out of the worst study, let's say, the study of the worst thing, then the best thing emerges. I figured out 3 weeks ago, there's this old idea that you can rescue your dead father from the belly of the beast. You see that in Pinocchio, for example, and you all take it for granted when you watch that movie, that it makes sense. And it does, but you don't know why. It's because if you face the thing that's most terrifying, then you can extract what's best out of it. And that's a lovely thing to know. I mean, that's a real optimistic view of courage. It's like, things are terrible, and maybe they're even worse than you think, including you. But regardless of how deep that abyss is, there's something that you can use that's real, more real than anything else, to put that at bay. And that's the rest of the story of equal before God. That's the other part of it. And then that's the optimistic part. So then think about that. So look, your society, my society as well, your society is predicated on the idea that each of us is a cornerstone, not only of the state, but of being itself. But let's just say of the state, right? You're all sovereign individuals. The integrity of the state rests on your shoulders. Otherwise, you wouldn't have the right to vote. That's one of your rights, right? You have the rights of a sovereign individual. Well, do you or not? Well, you act it out. You treat each other that way. You demand the rights. Maybe you don't go with the corresponding responsibility, but you certainly demand the rights. You're very annoyed when you don't get them. It looks like you believe it. So what are you believing exactly? Well, you're believing something like, well, there's enough to you so that you can be validly construed as the foundational cornerstone of the state. And what that means is that the state's integrity depends on you. And well, what does that mean? Well, it must mean that there's something more to you than meets the eye, because otherwise that would be a pretty stupid idea, wouldn't it? If we're all useless creatures, fundamentally speaking, you know, if we were a dime a dozen or a dime a billion, and there was nothing to us intrinsically, if we had no intrinsic worth, that self-evident worth, well, then it would be if none of that existed, it would be perfectly preposterous to presume that you had the right to vote and that the integrity of the state depended on the integrity of your choices. But that's the other thing that I learned when I was studying totalitarianism, is that takes us back to the beginning of the lecture as well. It's like, states degenerate into hell when people start to act like devils. And that's the right level of analysis. It's like, is the state everything it should be? No. Are you? No. Well, then fix that. Because you're the cornerstone of the state. It's the fundamental presupposition of your culture. It's one of the self-evident truths, in fact. It's the self-evident truth. It's like, it's a horrifying truth because it places a tremendous amount of responsibility on you. But then I'll close with this. But here's something cool, as far as I could tell. And this is part of this deep self-evidence as well. There's an idea. I was just reading the Gospel of Matthew today, and I came across a section where Christ tells his disciples to pick up their cross and follow him. It's very interesting. This is obviously before the crucifixion. It's very interesting. And then I was in Australia a while back, and I went to this Orthodox cathedral, and there was an interesting triptych there, so that's a three-part painting. And in the middle of the painting, there was a picture of Christ stepping upstairs to a cross and inviting people along, which is think about that image anthropologically. It's like, what the hell does that mean? What is that? What is that idea? It's like, accept your damn suffering and transcend it. That's what it means. It works. That's what that means. And so, and that's part and parcel of this self-evidence, you know? It's terrifying to think that you might be the locus of the stability of the state, but that's what we've decided. That's what we died for in wars, that idea to preserve it. That's what we believe when we say, well, we're all sovereign individuals of intrinsic value. There's supposed to be something fundamental about that. It's why the legal system can't just run roughshod over you, right? Even if you're a murderer, there's things the state can't do to you because of your intrinsic value. What could that be, that intrinsic value? And if it's there, it's got to be something pretty damn profound. If it can even trump murder, well, it is the case. You know, you have no option. You can choose evil or you can choose good. And if you choose good, then you stabilize the state. Or at least if you resist evil, that's at least something. You stabilize the state. And so I've been going around to people talking, well, my students first for a very long time, about this very idea that there's more to us than we think. And that's part of the self-evidence. That's part of the self-evident foundation upon which our culture is predicated. The notion that each individual is of inviolable value. And that that's actually true. And it's not true in sort of a game-like way. It's true because it's literally and metaphorically and spiritually and psychologically the case that the integrity and stability of the state depends on the ethical choices you make as an individual. And that's on you. And then, here's the cool part of that. And then it goes along with this idea of voluntarily accepting suffering. It's like, you know, people pursue happiness. That's one of your unalienable rights. And I'm not so sure that the pursuit of happiness is a good thing, but if you get it, well, more power to you. But I think that it's very necessary to pursue meaning. That's rule 7, do what is meaningful and not what is expedient. And here's the idea. It's like, well, life is a catastrophe, it's a tragedy, and it's tainted by malevolence, and everyone knows that. And you're all in, and it's a fatal game, and you need a reason to play it properly, right? You need something to buttress yourself against that tragedy and catastrophes. Well, what do you have to do that? Well, you have meaning. You have a sense of meaning and commitment and purpose. I could say, well, where are you going to find that? You're not going to find that exactly in your rights. You're going to find that in your responsibilities. And you think about this in your own life. Like, you think about what makes your life meaningful when the chips are down, or even when they're not. It's when you've taken on a burden that you believe is worth carrying. You think, then you can look at yourself in the mirror with some degree of self-respect, even when things are collapsing around you. You think, well, maybe the degree to which you can invest in life is proportional to the degree that you're willing to take responsibility for it. And that's the whole bloody catastrophe, right? That's malevolence and tragedy. You think, I'm going to confront that. I'm going to take that on, and I'm going to constrain the malevolence, and I'm going to work to rectify the tragedy to the degree that's possible. And that's my noble goal in life. And what's so interesting about that is that it's an instant antidote to the suffering. Because then you have something worth doing. It's like, it's really worth doing. You know, it's worth getting up in the morning when you're not feeling so damn well. And maybe it's worth not having that 10th drink for. You know, it's worth making some sacrifices for. And you have some meaning that imbues your life. And that's one of the things that also stabilizes you as part of the bedrock of the state. And all of that seems to me to be true. You know, and it's interesting because now I've traveled many, many places, and I've spoken with thousands and thousands of people, and many people have told me that they've been watching my lectures and reading my book, and they've been trying to tell the truth, and they've been trying to take on more responsibility, and as a consequence, their lives are inconceivably better. Not that they're necessarily good, you know, because your life can be really terrible and be inconceivably better than it was and still not be that good. But it's better, and the trajectory is good. Well, so I'm hoping, you know, in these times of unparalleled change, when we have an unbroken expanse of possibility in front of us, with everything we're able to do technologically, you know, we can reshape the world in the next 50 years in whatever way we choose. We can get rid of hunger. The UN has already projected that by the year 2030, given the current rate of economic expansion, there won't be a single person in the world who meets present-day criteria for absolute poverty. We could do, right? 18 years. It's not very long. It's a generation. It's nothing. It's as fast as you could hope that it could possibly be done. You know, and there are people who are winning the war on terrible diseases, and God only knows how good we could make things. And I would say, well, and that's what we should do, and we're in a bit of a crisis of confidence in the West right now, and that's really a problem, because we're at a crisis of confidence just at the point where the principles that we laid out are being played out in most of the world and working. And so I'm hoping, well, we can go back down to the bottom of things and discover what we've lost, and to put our foundation back in place, and to, from that perspective, position, develop the courageous wherewithal to adopt as much responsibility as we possibly can as unique individuals, and that as a consequence of that we'll tilt everything towards the good and away from the catastrophe. And I truly believe that if enough people do that, then, or maybe even if one person does it well enough, who knows how these things work, that will be the result, and that's within our grasp. And so that's a good place to stop. So thank you.
There were a bunch of these. A lot of people wanted you to clarify your tweet about Kavanaugh.
Yes.
Oh yeah, okay. Well, I'll clarify it in two ways. The first thing is that I promised my son about a month ago that I wouldn't make casual statements on Twitter, that what I would do is write a blog post. And I should have. I mean, Eric Weinstein had posted a Twitter saying, well, we don't know what to do because we're kind of screwed both ways at the moment. You know, if Kavanaugh is taken out, you know, this was obviously before it looked like he was going to win the nomination or be approved. That only became clear in about the last 3 days. And so I was trying to put myself in Kavanaugh's position, thinking, okay, well, if he was a client of mine, what would I recommend? And I thought, well, it's very tricky. It's very difficult to put myself in someone's position like that. But I thought, well, the problem is he can't just withdraw, because his life is over if he withdraws. Okay, and then if he gets the nomination, well, then what? Well, then he's cleared, at least, as cleared as he's ever going to get, which is not entirely cleared, which is unfortunate, because the possibility that he can be entirely cleared is off the table. That's not going to happen. So he's in a position where he's being compromised. That's it. His reputation has been compromised. And this is completely independent of what he's done. I have no idea what he's done. Who the hell knows what happened 35 years ago? I've worked on court cases where people made accusations 40 years in the past. Man, and you think today is murky, you should try looking 40 years ago and see how murky that is. It's really... So then I thought, well, let's say he gets approved. But then what? You know, like I read today, for example, NBC News, this was their coverage. There's already 153,000 signatures on in a petition that's hypothetically sponsored by the Democrats, if I remember correctly. They're a fragmented group, so God only knows what that means. Well, so are the Republicans. It's not like it's a homogenous group. It's like, you know, there's crazy Republicans and there's crazy Democrats, and so it's hard to tell what that means, but there's already 153,000 signatures calling for his impeachment. You know, and I was thinking, well, if I put myself in Kavanaugh's position, which I can do to some degree, because people have gone after my reputation every bloody way, almost every way you could think of. Not every way. There's still ways they haven't. But lots of ways. And I thought, well, if the goal is peace, let's say, maybe the best possible outcome would be for Kavanaugh to get confirmed and then to withdraw on the hope that they could put another candidate in place who's as conservative so there'd be no loss on the political front, but so that maybe the next nomination process wouldn't be of a sort that leaves the whole structure of the judiciary subject to permanent partisan dispute. Now, so I thought, well, maybe we could have our cake and eat it too. He could be cleared because there's insufficient evidence to pursue him. He could still have his life. We could bring another conservative candidate on board. We, you know, I mean everyone. We could bring another conservative candidate on board. The Supreme Court could be filled, and some of the tension with regards to the polarized political system could be rectified. So that was my thinking, and like, I couldn't explain. I said a sentence that was stupid because I kind of thought that some of that would be self-evident, but of course it wasn't. And it was just foolishness, you know, on my part. I should have known that that wouldn't be self-evident. So I explained it some more today in a sequence of tweets, but that was the idea. And, you know, people said, no, that's wrong because if you let the accusers knock you out of the race, then they win, and all that does is embolden them, and you should know better than that because you have told people not to withdraw, and, you know, and look, fair enough, man. I mean, I don't know what the hell is the right way out of this mess. I mean, I don't see a clear path forward out of this. You know, what I see now is that, I mean, I don't like the believe the accuser philosophy. I think that's an appalling philosophy. You have to be naive beyond comprehension to think that that's a good idea, to think that people wouldn't misuse. If that was the rule, every accuser is right. Oh, that's a great rule. That is. You know, I'm not willing to give up the presumption of innocence or the idea that it's better to let, you know, 10 guilty people walk free than to convict one innocent person. That's a good bloody rule. That's a good rule. And we don't just give that rule up because we're feeling all empathic and morally superior about it. So, but we've got a problem. And the problem is that I don't see any way of moving this forward without exacerbating the polarized tension. Now, some of the people who objected to what I said, well, bring on the tension. Maybe we need to play this out thoroughly, you know, rather than making premature peace. It's like, look, could be. I mean, I can't tell. It was just, I was trying to think of some way that might work out in the relatively short term for everyone concerned. And it seemed to me that it would be something for Kavanaugh to consider because he would have got the nomination. So at this stage, that's a feather in his hat. I mean, it's a crumpled feather and it's a dirty hat because it's been such a bloody mess, but it's not nothing. It means he could walk away without being killed by this. That would be something. And maybe you could make a case that if he was acting, you could make a case that one way of acting in a patriotic manner, although not necessarily the only way, would be to sacrifice his personal ambition and allow another candidate to step in his place. And I'm not saying that's right. I'm just saying that that was, Jesus, just because you think something doesn't mean it's right. You know, I was trying to puzzle this through, and that's another possible path.
I think the short answer is Twitter sucks.
Well, definitely need to drink water before I do that. In order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive.
Stand up straight, stand up straight, stand up straight with your shoulders back. Stand up straight, stand up straight, stand up straight with your shoulders back. Stand up straight, 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 stand up straight with your shoulders back.